All right, I've been told that I can start. All right. Welcome to round 15 of the National Speech and Debate Tournament. Hang on. Never mind. I'll try this again. Welcome to round 15 of the National Speech and Debate Association's National Tournament. Congratulations to the teams who have made it to round 15. What an accomplishment. Those of you, thank you to the NSDA for hosting tonight, and thank you especially to our judges who are here judging, and thank you for all of the tremendous effort and work you've put in order to make this event possible. We will begin with teams 1065 and 1315. You may begin.
All right, cool. As long as everyone's ready, then I can start my constructive. Okay, before I begin, I would like to give as a brief content warning that this case does reference the existence of the human trafficking industry. We don't include any descriptions, graphic or non-graphic, of the practices used by traffickers beyond their use of social media. So I just wanted to let them know, especially since this is being live streamed. All right, then I'll start time on my first word. Somi and I negate the result. In the United States, social media is beneficial for democratic values. Contention 1 is polarization. According to Shearer 17, 67% of Americans get political news from social media. This increases polarization in 2 ways. The first is through echo chambers, as Modugno 21 finds that social media platforms populate users' feeds based on their previous interactions, which hides opposing viewpoints on key issues. NPR 16 explains that this occurs because their algorithms are aimed to increase engagement for profit. In fact, Backsheet 15 finds that people who use social media encounter 15% less news expressing opposing viewpoints when compared to those that use other forms of media, and are 70% less likely to view the opposing content. This phenomenon of reinforcing one's views due to a saturation of like-minded content is known as an echo chamber, which Sanelli 20 concludes increases polarization as the lack of exposure to alternative opinions guides people away from common ground. The second way that social media increases polarization is misinformation. Caballero 20 explains that because social media platforms are able to rapidly deliver an overabundance of information, fake news has become more prevalent, exemplified by the 2016 presidential election. In fact, Brown 21 quantifies that misinformation is 70% more likely to be shared on social media, allowing it to reach people 6 times faster than the truth. In addition, the Pew Research Center 21 finds that social media users are worse at identifying fake news when compared to those that use other forms of media. All of these characteristics enable the spread of misinformation that exacerbates polarization. The impact is terrorism. Jensen 18 finds that 90% of American extremists utilize social media in an attempt to radicalize new members. In addition, social media speeds up the radicalization process, as Jensen furthers that the average amount of time elapsed between first exposure to extremist beliefs and launching a terrorist attack decreased from 18 months to 13 months. As a result, O'Hara 21 finds that terrorist attacks have hit groundbreaking levels, quantifying that 1 in 5 terrorist attacks in 2020 were directly cited by social media. Terrorism is a direct detriment to democracy, as Byman 19 explains that terrorist attacks can undermine faith in governments, convincing citizens to favor more extreme voices and turn to dangerous actors like militias. Contention 2 is dehumanization. Social media is a weapon of the oppressors. Its platforms have become the tools used to ingrain the sexist ideals of our society into Americans, perpetuating narratives that dehumanize them into objects. It has fundamentally altered the female image in 2 ways. The first is self-objectification, which occurs when individuals treat themselves as objects to be viewed. Feldman 18 finds that the use of social media leads to greater levels of self-objectification, as the spread of idealized images cause women to internalize beauty standards. That's really bad, as Swift 21 explains that when women are repeatedly objectified, it contributes to harmful stereotypes that normalize violence. In fact, Swift quantifies that only 1 in 5 women report gender-based crime, which showcases how they have been dehumanized. But the second way is through trafficking, as FG20 explains that to maximize profits, more traffickers have turned to social media, as Withers 19 quantifies that 55% of cases were first conducted through it. As a result, OSC 20 quantifies that trafficking has increased 18-fold in 5 years. Trafficking disproportionately targets women, as Booney 14 states that females represent 75% of the entire industry. The selling of females as if they are property strips them of their identity, as Rise 16 explains that it enables the dehumanization of females as it views them deserving of exploitation. Clearly, dehumanization directly impedes on women's rights and safety. But beyond the actions of individuals, O'Connell 18 notes that such narratives have led to oppressive legislation. For example, Supreme Court case IV v. Bolivia reinforced gender hierarchies and violated the reproductive rights. Ultimately, the oppression that females face in society is detrimental to the core of democracy, equality. However, Pacone 17 concludes that by encouraging higher levels of gender equality, we reinforce democracy through peace and security, highlighting the need to deconstruct the dehumanizing narrative that enables such inequality to flourish in the first place. Thus, we negate.
Can I see two things? First is that 55% of trafficking is from social media, and then the other one is that social media led to the 20% dehumanization report. Thank you.
Okay, I just sent both cards.
I got it, thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. We affirm contention 1 is strengthening democratic processes. With the technological innovations of the 21st century, social media has an unparalleled ability to reinforce the democratic process. This manifests in two key ways. First is trust in the government. Social media builds a bridge between ordinary Americans and the bureaucratic, often secretive government, increasing transparency and trust. Through social media, candidates connect both with their constituents and can be held accountable for their actions, which helps voters feel more connected to them. Indeed, Anderson quantifies that the number of Americans who are on social media for political involvement has more than tripled in a few years. Monica 18 finds that this communication is critical to maintaining democratic values because 69% of Americans believe that social media is important for getting elected officials to pay attention to issues. With greater interaction and accountability, people will be more incentivized to vote, and American democracy will be more effective in carrying out what the people actually want. Second is political participation. Politics can be a tough sphere to enter. Luckily, Yildirim 20 finds that social media helps level the playing field in politics, where money and access to formal communication channels pose huge barriers to new entrants. Additionally, Fisher 20 quantifies that more than 3 million US voters have already registered through social media, and an even larger number have gotten critical voter registration information through social media. Apart from directly encouraging registration, Santoni reports that social media also indirectly pressures votes when friends on Facebook or followers on Twitter post about voting, which has already led to hundreds of thousands of new votes. Democracy and thus democratic values are dependent on exercising the right to vote because a democracy is only as strong as its free and fair elections. It is a mechanism that holds the government accountable and represents the opinions and values of everyday Americans. Contention 2 is giving a voice to the people. Social media is a unique tool of the digital era that equips ordinary Americans with the tools to get their voices heard. It does this in two ways. First is providing a platform. No longer do people need to be invited onto CNN or Fox News to have their opinions represented. Indeed, Anderson 18 writes that social networking sites have emerged as a key venue for political debate and discussion, and at times a place to engage in civic-related activities. The Pew Research Center quantifies that around half of Americans have engaged in some form of political activity on social media in the past year. 67% believe that these sites are important for creating sustained movements for social change, and 58% agree that social media is important for influencing policy decisions. Second is strengthening activism. Not only do social media users circulate information and resources through likes, shares, and retweets, but the platforms also provide individuals and groups with the ability to communicate and coordinate plans for protests. In fact, Monica 18 quantifies that 4 in 10 social media users say these platforms are important to them for finding others who share their views about important issues, getting involved with political or social issues that are important to them, and providing a venue to express their political opinions. The capability to do all of this, raise their voices, organize and activate, share information, demand social and legislative change is crucial to creating and sustaining a movement, and social media gives Americans a physical and, more importantly, a virtual space to do that. Gillian 20 thus concludes that protesting is often the sole indicator of political discontent because they place issues on the political agenda and work to make those issues salient to the public and to individuals in power. The United States is a representative democracy, which establishes representation as a fundamental democratic value. It is the underlying force that empowers the nation's government of the people to be for the people, and is the reason why voting is specifically distinct to democratic systems. Giving a voice to the people is an indispensable aspect of representing the people. Thus, we're proud to affirm. Are you ready for cross?
Can I have one piece of evidence?
Yeah.
It's that protests are the sole indicator.
I just sent it.
Once we get it, then we can start cross.
I just got her email.
Okay, cool. We got it. Are you ready for cross?
Yeah.
Could I have first question?
Go ahead.
All right, I'll start my time when I start talking. So let's start on your first link about democratic processes where you talk about increasing accountability. Just want to double check. So what you're saying is that by having a platform where like politicians and voters can directly communicate with each other, voters can hold politicians accountable.
Yes.
Okay, then if that's the case, why does Trump, our own, like one of the presidents we've had, why did it take until a terrorist attack happened on the Capitol attacks before he was finally like held accountable?
I think he was held accountable throughout the duration of his presidency by Democrats and by liberals on social media who checked back on every single thing that he did. I would say that comparatively, only mainstream news sources like CNN would have the ability to do this. But the thesis of our case is that ordinary Americans should also have the ability to speak out against the president. Can I take a question?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. So your evidence says that 55% of domestic minor sex trafficking survivors met their traffickers for the first time using text, a website, or a mobile app. Where does this say social media?
Yeah, so if you look, first of all, this includes social media. So if you look at the line before, it talks about how potential victims of trafficking alone were recruited through internet platforms, most often Facebook. So that's your link into social media.
Where does it say that?
The first line that's highlighted.
Okay, so it's like also online dating sites and chat rooms. So the point I'm getting at is even if right now some people are getting sex trafficked or human trafficked through social media, then without it, there would also be alternative online platforms
Right.
like
So
Craigslist and online dating sites.
So what we're trying to argue is if you look at the resolution, we're not trying to do a world debate whether or not if like it would be the same with or without social media. All we have to prove is that social media is still contributing to the problem and that as a result, it's still a net harm. So we would argue because social media is still playing a huge role into it, literally saying that most often it was Facebook, it's a huge contributor. But could I have a question?
I don't think that's sure. We'll come back to the resolution later.
Yeah, sure. So let's go back to your democratic processes where you talk about like voter registration. So you talk about how it pushed 3 million US voters. So what exactly does social media uniquely do to help level the playing field and like you say in your subpoint?
There are two parts of the political participation argument. The first one is that it levels the playing field for politicians, as in you don't have to have connections on major news sites in order to get your voice heard. You can go through social media, you can get thousands or even millions of followers without having the established connections that a lot of incumbents have already.
Could I ask a follow-up to that then?
Go ahead.
If that's the case, have we been seeing a decrease in the incumbency advantage that you're talking about?
Comparatively, yes. So I would say even if people who are newcomers don't get elected, the fact that they gain followers on social media gives the perception they have more support, which holds incumbents more accountable to their actions.
Wait, but if they don't get elected, then how do you link into any impact into democracy?
It's about holding politicians accountable. So that means, like, for example, even if AOC doesn't pass a policy in Congress, her opinions and her support are influencing the policy decisions in Congress and making them more liberal. But that's
okay. Yeah, sure.
All right, Leah and I are going to take running prep. starting now. All right, stop prep. I got 1:50. So Lee and I should have 2 minutes and 10 seconds left. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, cool. It's just gonna go straight down their case. Everyone good? Okay. Time starts now. On civic engagement, our arguments will always come as a prerequisite to civic engagement. Byman 19 finds terrorism undermines trust in the government and democratic processes, which lead to authoritarian roots. Dehumanization diminishes women's perception of their own competence, meaning they don't participate in politics. Safety and security should always come first. But then, on the idea of accountability, they say social media allows for politicians to speak directly to voters and be accountable. But turn it, because social media allows politicians to propagate misinformation. Isaac 19 writes that social media companies like Facebook do not fact check ads from politicians, even if they contain lies, allowing for misinformation to spread rampant. Look at Trump. It literally took a terrorist attack for people to finally hold them accountable. They say that liberals continuously held them accountable, but every single time we tried to impeach or have any sort of legislative action against Trump, it never worked. But then they say we hold people accountable and level the playing field. If that is the case, then why do we see 90% of incumbents in office right now? It's clearly not a decreasing trend. But then on the idea of a productive debate, turn it, because social media cuts off the flow of ideas. Higgins 20 writes, people look for evidence supporting what they already agree with. Social media provides recommendations based on past viewing history and feeds people information of things that they're more likely to agree with. That's why Mitchell 20 writes, Americans who primarily turn to social media for political news are less aware about news issues and more likely to have heard a number of false or unproven claims. But then on voter turnout, first, false info on social media leads to further voter suppression. Brennan 21 finds that in the 2016 election, Russian hackers engaged in voter suppression by posting false messages and ads on social media that reached 126 million Americans. They directed people to vote by text, which is not an option anywhere, and targeted African American communities to boycott the election. But second, disinformation about voting through social media causes stricter voter legislation. Aster 21 finds that Trump's false claims about voter fraud through social media laid the foundation for numerous Republican-led bills for more restrictive voter rules. As a result, lawmakers in over 33 states made bills to restrict voting, many of which have already been signed. These bills show how disinformation can take on a life of its own in social media and form a feedback loop that shapes policy decisions for years to come. But then they cite the 2020 election had great turnout. But Pew Research Center states that this rise was due to the expansion of mailing ballots and early voting from COVID-19. The more accurate trend to observe is without the pandemic from 2012 to 2016, in which these changes were not made, and therefore the number of ballots or voters did not increase. But then
on the idea of activism. First, their argument is holistically untrue. Chenoweth 16 finds nearly 70% of civil resistance campaigns succeeded during the 1990s, where only 30% have succeeded since 2010. She gives 3 warrants explaining, first, governments can use social media to manipulate activists. Second, performative activism on social media stunts progress. And third, social media enables armed actors to coordinate direct violence against activists. That's why Waldman 19 writes, social media has been used as a tool to expand state surveillance, causing the surveillance of movements and increased police preference. It turns their impact as Waldman continues that minority groups are now often targeted by law enforcement via social media, even if there are no violent charges to begin with. But then, a Northwestern study finds that when people are introduced to social media, it reinforces their own viewpoints, which is why the Pew Research Center finds that the partisan gap on over 40 political issues has more than doubled over the past 25 years. This applies to social movements that they talk about, like Black Lives Matter or pro-trans healthcare, since social media is divisive because it grounds people in their viewpoints and minimizes support for social movements and pushes politicians into a stalemate. But then you can turn it again, as The Economist finds that social media movements are becoming a substitute for participating in party politics. Rather than pursuing legislative change, young protesters flit from issue to issue, creating movements that work well to define one's own identity and boost awareness of an issue for half a day, but never turn the political activism into concrete power or legislative action. That's why it's a clear neg vote.
Can we see one card from the prerequisite weighing that you said that objectification leads to not participating in politics? Thank you.
All right, it should be sent now.
I still have not gotten it. Has anyone seen it?
I've gotten it.
Oh wait, is it gore through?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I mixed it up with the other card. Never mind, just
You're
got it. Is there a specific part, because this is quite a long card?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing to look at is, hold on, give me one second, let me pull it up.
Yeah,
It's
I
the
think it's
part where it
quite
goes, when women self-objectify, their cognitive and attention resources are diminished.
Self-objectify. Okay, wait, you said cognitive. Okay, I see it now. Thank you. I'm gonna call
Just that flaw.
Mm-hmm. All right. That was 25. Cool. Is anybody not ready? I will begin by responding to their responses, then I'll move on to their case. In that case, my time starts now. Let's start on their first prerequisite. They talk about trust, but notice that overall trust would be going down no matter what. Our evidence is actually saying specifically because of social media, it increases perception of transparency and has empirically led to more trust in the US government. But then second, they say that objectification leads to not participating in politics. Not only did more women, like 68% of them, vote in 2020, but also we say that then they'd be turning to activism instead. I'll get to that later. First, they cross out misinformation. I'll get to that in their case. Then they talk about insurrection. Our evidence from Kim actually says that this insurrection would have happened faster absent social media because these individuals would be actually connecting in other ways to actually fuel the aggressive rhetoric even more. Instead, once again, the comparative is that the incumbency would be worse. Their responses don't do the comparative between a world with or without social media. That's really important because we'd say the best way to isolate social media's benefits and harms is to imagine what would happen with or without it. Next, they talk about echo chambers. That's their case. Next, they talk about voter suppression. Notice that first, Lee actually explains that Russia is finding other ways, i.e. cyber attacking these databases in the first place, so it's not just social media. And second, their role in the 2020 election has been greatly minimized. Next, on misinformation, once again, their case, I'll get to that, but actually instead, we'd say that this misinformation is just being scapegoated, which means any single amount of misinformation is going to trigger their impacts of Republicans trying to cut down on voter accessibility. Next, they talk about the 70% to 30% empiric. First, this is globally, it's talking about Iraq and Chile, not the United States. Second, a lot of these movements are working right now, i.e. Hai explains that the Me Too movement has brought around federal to local legislation about non-disclosure agreements, which are the ones that harm sexual assault victims, and then also killings of African Americans have been gone down by 10%, which is why Vox explains that the BLM movement is also working. Next, surveillance is always going to happen no matter what. You have human intelligence, which infiltrated BLM and things like text messages. But then third, they talk about performative activism. Performative activism will always exist because the people who don't truly care about the cause and advocate for change properly won't be doing that in a world without social media. So instead, it's an on-net good if they're still bringing awareness, spreading things like infographics, and helping organize them. Let's move to their case. At the top, first with echo chambers. First, Newton actually explains that for polarization, it was actually rising before social media for things like growing racial and ethnic divides, loss in senatorial courtesy, gerrymandering, which is why the most polarized demographic is people over 65 years old. Second, with echo chambers, Smith-Twain explains that 80% of Americans would have been in them regardless because they'd have no interaction from the other party, which is why third, you turn the argument against them. Social media users double the amount of opposing party content that they use for news, which is why Parent-Twain explains that 25% of US social media users have changed their views about a political or social issue due to social media, which is a rise from 15% in 2018, which is why Barbara actually explains that people empirically become more moderate after social media exposure, like Twitter. Next, on misinformation, first, notice that Facebook already has taken down 99.8% of false accounts proactively within minutes of registration, which is why more misinformation is actually on alternative sources. And second, misinformation will always exist on things like news. For example, partisan cable news has been rising, which is why UPenn actually explains that you have 35% more accuracy under things like social media because you have the discourse. Even if things are spreading it, we say people are talking about it. Let's move to C2 for women. So first, they talk about body positivity. First, these standards existed way before with things like journals, magazines, movies, the internet in general, which is why second, turn it against them because of the body positivity movement. Hoshi Twin explains that this did not exist before social media, and the power is new because now you have generations of teens that are actually working and building a community with one another. On trafficking, first, their own evidence is talking about the internet as a whole. Second, if they weren't online, they'd be preying on people who are vulnerable in other ways, i.e. the homeless or people who have substance abuse issues. But then third, social media actually helps authorities track traffickers because the ET explains that government agencies like the NSA use social media data to track criminals and specifically trafficking. And UN19 finds that we see a record high number of cases detected and a record high conviction rate due to a focus in data collection specifically. And then finally turn it one more time because we say that you have to create these support networks for survivors on social media insofar as things like trafficking can always exist without it. Thus, we're very proud to affirm.
Can you send the last three turns on trafficking?
The last turns, or I didn't read 3 turns.
Or just social media can be used to track traffickers, and then data collection, and then support networks.
And then could you also send the Barbara and evidence that you read on our C1?
Sure, could you put those in the Zoom chat so I don't miss any? Thank you. Oh, and just to be sure, okay, wait, never mind. I see the Barbara one. Okay, it is sent. The last one also is a PDF, but if you want to see the original file, I can send that along.
Once we get it, then we'll start prep. Oh wait, not prep. You guys can start cross. Sorry.
All right, I got all of them. Are you guys start cross?
Yep.
Okay, time starts now. So you tell me in your rebuttal that the Capitol insurrection would have happened faster absent social media. But considering that all of the people from the Capitol insurrection were able to listen to misinformation Trump spread about the voter fraud, and on top of that, they were able to connect through social media. How is that true? Like, what's the warrant?
We're saying that things like voter fraud and this misinformation campaign did not solely exist on social media, i.e., Fox News had a lot of things that had to do with that. So we're saying that comparatively, you have more checkback in the world without social media than you just have these news sources telling people, yes, the election was rigged without people actually contesting it.
Wait, really quick follow-up to that. So we read you in our case that right-wing terrorists are able to connect with each other through social media. So absent social media, how would people from the Capitol insurrection be able to connect with each other and have that large scale of a terrorist attack
Yeah,
absent social media?
Yeah, so actually there are a lot of encrypted messaging platforms that people use, especially extremists, i.e. there are 200 extremist groups that are anti-BLM that are congregating on encrypted messaging platforms.
Okay, so it's just other platforms exist.
Yeah.
Okay, you can take a question.
Okay, sure. So on your case, you tell me that fake news spreads faster, right?
Mhm.
And is this just measuring the idea of people seeing the news?
Yeah.
So, based on social media algorithms, these get spread when anybody has or any kind of interaction with the post, right? So, anybody who comments on it is going to help the post spread.
Yeah. I mean, that's why fake news spreads faster is more people interact with it. It tends to be more misguided things that are more extremist content. And that's why fake news incites more reactions from people and
Right.
gets
I was
more.
just clarifying that any kind of interaction would spread fake news on social media.
Yeah, but fake news tends to get more interaction because it's more out there. Okay. So on trafficking, you say that people would be able to traffic absent social media, correct?
Mhm.
Considering the fact that social media literally makes every single woman open up literally to the entire public. So anyone can message anyone in terms of any woman in terms of social media. How would people be able to do such large scale efforts of trafficking?
Hold on. So, first of all, that is definitely not true. Everybody has the option of whether or not you make your account public and accessible to
Wait,
everybody.
that's like a version of victim blaming, right? Just
Oh,
because
no,
I
I'm
make
not.
my
I'm
account
not. It's
public.
definitely not. I'm just saying that the claim that anybody can message anybody is false. There are some check-ins there. Like you can on Facebook choose not to accept a message request or choose not to friend someone. I'm not
Right.
saying that it's the victim's fault for that.
It's not
But
just random message requests. It's things like fake job posting on Facebook and things like that that are spread.
these kinds of job postings or ads exist on websites on the internet. So that's just an
Right.
aspect of the internet and it's
Right,
not
but
a fundamental intrinsic issue just of social media. So we're just saying that things like the movements don't spread as easily on just a website. So it's a net benefit there, but we're across.
all right. Leah and I will take prep starting now.
Okay, that was 1:30, so we have about 40 seconds left. It's just gonna go defending our case and then going down their case. Is everyone ready? Okay. I'll start my time when I start talking. On this prereq weighing, they say that they solve better already through increasing transparency. But as seen in First Cross, they can't tell you anything about how they actually have an impact of increasing transparency, except for that people can express viewpoints. Clearly not increasing any trust in the government, as it's only breeding more animosity. You're always going to value our Byman card that tells you that terrorism directly undermines the trust in the government, as well as dehumanization prevents people from wanting to engage as women doubt their own self-perception. Basically, at the top shelf, all responses about having alternative causes is not going to be relevant to this resolution. All we have to prove is that social media is still contributing to a harm and still doing harmful things to democracy. Let's start on polarization. We tell you that social media increases it in two ways. The first is echo chambers, and the second is misinformation. And as a result, we see terrorism at an all-time high, with 90% of extremists being recruited through social media, and 1 in 5 attacks directly citing social media as a cause. They tell you a couple things. First, this idea of polarization predates it. Once again, not a relevant point. Just because it's always existed doesn't mean social media hasn't been a catalyst for it. That's why you see the empirics that show it's at a highest level now, as Kilgore 20 quantifies that at the end of 2018, we had an 82% difference in approval ratings across parties. Then they talk about how like echo chambers is non-unique. One, we're not talking about the public. It doesn't mean if they're in other echo chambers, the fact that we see terrorism content still getting more people through social media is still a harm. Then they talk about how they have diverse news sources and can check back for it. But Robson 18 finds that by reading more diverse news sources on social media, it usually backfires, because since these people are on echo chambers, they subconsciously dismiss disagreeing evidence, polarizing them even further. Then they read this Penn study that it increases the accuracy by 35%, but the author of their own study later went on to say that this cannot be applied to social media, as the study assumes that within an echo chamber, every person has the same amount of influence like they talk about in geographic locations. But social media is different, because since it's centralized with big influencers, if one person in the centralized who has a larger influence is more polarized, it's only amplified throughout the group. That's why this contention is going to be continued. But on dehumanization, we tell you that social media perpetuates in two ways. The first is self-objectification, and the second is trafficking. They read you 3 responses. The first is this idea of activism, but one, we argue this is often performative and doesn't accomplish anything. That's what Freeman 21 writes you, and that ultimately undermines the idea of legislation being taken. Then they say how we can't attribute it all because of the internet. That's not our burden. We just need to prove that social media is still contributing to the issue. Then they read this idea of catching criminals. This response is extremely flawed. Catching traffickers relied on people being trafficked first. Therefore, they're not solving anything about women being dehumanized, insofar that their response is purely reactionary and can't solve back for the fact that the trends is increasing 185%. Clearly, the benefits is not outweighing the harms. Onto their case on accountability and productive debate and voter turnout, misinformation all links in. Specifically on voter turnout, we tell you about this idea of voter suppression leading to legislation, and you're always going to want to value this response, as these are long-term reforms that suppress versus a short-term benefit of helping people vote in one election cycle. That's why this 2020 election idea is an outlier, as mishandling of COVID-19 and mail-in ballots were larger causes. And if you look at the larger trend, social media has no impact. On activism, we tell you this largely unhelpful and actually hurt by social media. That's the Chenoweth 16 evidence, but they specifically concede the idea that legislation doesn't get changed. At that point, they're not helping social media. They're only needing to surveillance, and that's really bad.
Jen, do you want any cards before we call? Cool. Then we're gonna start. That was 225 used, so we have 110 left.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. The best way to evaluate the benefits and harms of social media is to see it in context. If all the harms of the con talks about would have happened anyways, and all of the benefits the pro talks about are specific to social media, on social media is beneficial. It's not educational to debate in a bubble. You compare the two worlds. Let's look firstly at the framing. On the first prong about terrorism, they say we don't explain where trust increases. They just don't address our warrant. We say that trust increases because there's an increase in interaction with the government, which increases trust overall, which is why comparatively the after all is better. But the second prong of this is that women don't participate in the government, which they drop all of Karina's responses, which is really silly. We say women turn out more than men in the presidential election in 2020, which shows their argument isn't true. Let's talk about our argument and why it's specific to social media. The thesis of our case, which completely is dropped in the summary, our first part of our first contention is simply that ordinary Americans simply don't have the ability to speak out on CNN or Fox News, which is why social media on it increases freedom of speech more. This is a dropped argument. Freedom of speech is a democratic value and it increases representation. But let's go into the activism point, which is the second part of our argument. They say the effectiveness of movements is decreasing. This isn't true insofar as we said Me Too was entirely reliant on the anonymity of social media, and it created more sexual harassment legislation, and also BLM, which has decreased the number of killings of African Americans by 10%. We say it is working right now. It would have worked much, much slower in their world. The reasoning is simple. Terrorist attacks happen when a few people group together, and these attacks can happen. But movements can only happen on social media when you reach millions of people. That is the distinction with social media and other sources. But specifically on our first argument about democratic processes, they just say that misinformation decreases the ability for people to vote because there are more restrictions. But this isn't true insofar as they can see that misinformation always happens. That means misinformation will always be scapegoated. Let's go to their case. There are a few ways we win on their case that win us the round. The first one is on polarization. That is because polarization is highest in people who are over 65 years old who don't even use social media. But we say that comparatively, you actually decrease echo chambers. This warrant is not addressed in the last speech. We say that people interact with 2 times the number of diverse content. The warrant is because people in person only talk to like 20 people, but on social media, they can talk to 2,000 people. That's why there's more diverse perspective. And on it, the empirics show there's an increase in moderation. This actually solves back for the radicalization argument because echo chambers actually cause radicalization, but if we comparatively solve back for echo chambers, we can also solve back for radicalization. But then on the second point about misinformation, we also win here on a turn. That is because there's 2 times the number of opposing information on social media, and it increases discourse. Their entire argument about fake news spreading farther actually helps us. It spreads farther because people are commenting that they disagree with it. This is comparatively better because with TV news reports, you simply cannot do this. You can't interact with the content. That is why on social media increase the accuracy of information by 35%, which decreases echo chambers even more. But on their last argument about the narratives, firstly, they drop a few turns. One is the body positivity movement, which happens specifically because of social media and creating community against things like sex trafficking. But secondly, we say the social media creates more support groups, which actually solves back on and has a bigger scope than their argument because sex trafficking will always happen insofar as there's other means like the internet, but we say the only way to create communities is with social media.
Okay, are you ready for ground?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll start my time when I start talking. Okay, so in your summary, you talk about how this idea of like terrorism can always collectivize with or without social media and there's no like unique impact, but movements can only happen through social media. Explain that to me.
So the idea is the idea is that for terrorist attacks, you only need like 10 people who agree with you. These can be literally 10 people in your neighborhood that you already know. But in order to create social movements and a legislative change, you need millions of people to support you, which can only happen through social media. That means terrorist attacks, there are always other means. Like you can just text message, but text messaging can't create an entire social movement that creates legislative change.
That's why things like the dark web or encrypted messaging are really, really much exploited to do things like extreme.
Right, but then we read you the 90% evidence that 90% of extremists recruit people through social media. And we would argue by having more people, like you say, it becomes more powerful. But you argue that you can't have like any people organized through like without social media. But why would we see things like the 1960s protests or the 1920s women's rights movement happen as a result and be more successful, if that's the case?
There are 2 points that you bring up in that. So first of all, we'd say that when it comes to the actual people meeting over social media, right? It just says that it plays a role, not that it's only from social media. And once again, remember Jen's framework, which says that if these things can still happen in a world without social media, then they can still exist. Radicalization can still exist. Your second part was Yours was about the activism, right? So we're in a digital world. It's not right to expect that movements have to only congregate with people. Like those, for instance, the civil rights movement took decades, and people had to rely on in-person connections, which is not necessarily good, because then that means it takes a lot longer time. Instead of right now, you can almost immediately coalesce a lot of people who share your opinions and then enact faster change. That's why i.e. BLM, like it started trending 1 year ago, but then you already see that the killings are down 10%.
Okay, sure. You can have a question.
Okay, Jen, do you have one, or I can?
You can take one.
Thank you. So I want to go back to this argument about how misinformation goes a little bit farther, right? So insofar as any interaction means that a post can be seen by more people, then doesn't that actually exclude the idea that this kind of information might also include the counterfactuals from people who disagree?
Wait, okay.
No, a lot of information goes unfact-checked. If you put a news article on that, it's not like millions of people are commenting, no, we disagree with this. It's perceived as true. That's the issue.
I don't think that's true at all, because the problem is that with the TV news report, you literally can't talk to it. Like you can't say you're wrong.
Well, the difference between tradition.
Sentence, please.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So on social media, when you post something or a news report, there are always people commenting. There's like probably not a single political post on Facebook or on Twitter that doesn't have comments checking back on it, which is why we say it's comparatively better than just like talking to a screen. But
okay, well, we'd say the comparative is much better for traditional news media sources, because there are hundreds of editors for things like the CNN or Huffington Post or New York Times, whereas social media is just user-generated content. People can put out there whatever they want.
Fox News saying that the election is rigged was really well fact-checked.
Well, that's just one polarized source that you're talking about. There's plenty of that on social media too.
Also, yeah, like when you have social media, you allow basically anyone to spread any rumor. That's why you see things like QAnon get a lot more like traction and stuff like that.
Okay, sure. We can cover this in speeches.
Okay, I think, how much time do Leah and I have left? I think we have 45 seconds left. Okay. I'm going to take our last 45 seconds of prep starting now. All right, that's all our prep. Okay, it's gonna go our case and then their case, and then I'll do weighing throughout. Is everyone good? Okay. On the prerequisite analysis, remember, our arguments always come before civic engagement, because Byman 19 tells you that things like terrorism and extremism will undermine trust in our government, which they say is really important themselves. And things like dehumanization will diminish women's perception of their own competence, which means they don't feel that they're worthy enough to participate in politics. Things like safety and security and trust in democracy should come first. They say trust increases because it now accountability. But just because people are talking and expressing their viewpoints on the internet, it doesn't actually lead to greater trust in the government. Then they say women turnout. It's not about just women turnout. It's about the dehumanization narrative overall. But then they read a ton of responses that say things happen absent a world of social media. That's not what the resolution is looking at. It's just asking, does social media do something bad for democracy, or does it do something good? That's why you isolate it to just what social media does. But then on polarization, we see echo chambers and misinformation, which is why 90% of extremists were recruited through social media, and terrorist attacks are at an all-time high, where 1 in 5 are directly caused by social media. They say diverse viewpoints. Leah tells you that people just stick to their own viewpoint and it harnesses their own opinion more. They say old people exist, but if extremists are literally rising on social media right now through that means, it definitely includes a causality. Then they say there's a 35% increase in accuracy. Their own study says don't account this to social media. Then on dehumanization, polarization. We tell you that Withers 19 quantifies 55% of cases most often use social media in terms of human trafficking, like Facebook and Snapchat. This undermines equality. They say to alternative causes, it doesn't matter. They say catching criminals, it's just reactionary. Get rid of the patriarchal structure rather than trying to do something reactionary like activism as well. And then on voter turnout, 2 turns. Remember, it increases voter suppression and has more restrictive voter laws, and this misinformation is spread through social media. But even then, on activism, Chanowitz 16 finds that there's a 40% decrease in these whole movements that are happening overall because they can use social media to manipulate activists and spread misinformation overall, which is why activism isn't helping.
We have 110 left. All right. I'll mainly be signposting as I go, but it's generally our case, their case. Is anybody not ready? Okay. In that case, my time starts now. Judges ask what democratic value they're advocating for. In rebuttal, summary, and final focus, they have dropped our platform argument about the freedom of speech, which is actually about giving ordinary Americans a voice. That is the democratic value that has gone completely conceded. Hundreds of millions of Americans now have social media to actually voice their opinion instead of not actually being invited to go to CNN or Fox. Now, specifically on the argument, they first say a prerequisite about transparency and trust. Notice that insofar as extremism will always happen, as they concede it's not even just social media, but also social media uniquely increases the perception of transparency and trust, which is an empirical study, then you see is better on our side. Similarly, they've conceded that actually turnout for women is higher and activism is also higher under a world where you have social media. Let's move to our second argument, because in the end, the only response they extend is that the efficacy has gone down. This is a card that I actually indicted in 3 ways. Not only is it not talking about the US whatsoever, it doesn't say social media once, and also, finally, we give you examples of it working. We say BLM has led to 10% less killings of African Americans. Me Too has led to federal and local legislation about non-disclosure agreements. All of these are indications that social media is working and is on net beneficial, because you need this platform in order to connect the millions of people to enact change, and the change is happening. Specifically on framing, they just say that you have to look solely at social media. This is not educational to debate. The best way to evaluate the benefits and harms of social media is to see it in context, because if all of their harms would still exist regardless, then all of the benefits of ours are specific to social media, then it's very clear that social media is an on-net good. Let's go to their case. We tell you that there's so many alternative causes to extremism. They have encrypted messaging servers, but instead on their actual link, which was about echo chambers, notice that empirically 1/4 of Americans have changed their opinions after being on social media. They've had a moderating effect. These are all actual statistics. So even if social media has some role, it is not actually doing the root cause, and the root cause is going down. Specifically on this argument about they dropped the body positivity movement, but either way, insofar as their argument about trafficking is intrinsic to internet, which is still going to maintain this patriarchal structure, then it's not an on-net good. We actually have the community and the activism that is needed to check back and help marginalized voices. It's a very clean AF battle on every argument here. Good round, y'all.
Good round.
Good round.
Congrats on making it this far.
Y'all too.
a reminder that if judges are just writing a ballot, then you can actually just go ahead and submit your decision, and then you can write your comments later. But that we start the tech for the next round at 7:30.
Okay, the decisions are in. It is a
Whoa. I
Sorry.
don't have the decision has not been confirmed.
No? Okay.
Yeah, there it goes. So you can announce the decision, and then we're going to wait for the live feed to be stopped. Okay. Yeah. So go ahead and yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay. You can say it aloud.
3-2 for the pro.
Okay. Yay. Let's go ahead and. Okay. Give me just a second. Waiting for tab.